Hi, my name is Ruby Mungoshi, and I'm a unit tutor. I work with Yaku Yonka. I tutor units 8 with him, terrains of water. I'm. What was that? Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I'll be moderating this last and final panel. So it's been quite eventful and great so far. So the order I have here, I just want to check that I get it right. So we're going to be joined by Adam. No, not Adam. Firstly, it's going to be Jeffrey Hogrefe, then Adam Kaasa, and then Alejandro Haiek Coll. And I believe Jeffrey Hogrefe is online.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Hogrefe, and I'm a professor of architecture, humanities, and media studies at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, US. And I'm also joined today with the co-author, Scott Ruff, who's with me.
Hello.
Scott, are you here?
Yes, can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm Scott Ruff. I'm an associate, I'm an adjunct associate professor at Pratt Institute, and Jeffrey Hogrefe and myself are co-authors to this paper that we'll be presenting today. And Jeffrey, go ahead. I guess I'll start our slideshow.
Yes. That would be great. The paper that we're presenting today arose out of our co-teaching and co-editing of the volume In Search of African American Space. And it develops specifically out of our shared work in the Black arts and tradition of aesthetics, Black aesthetics in architecture. And our observation is that contemporary architecture curriculum is largely developed on abstract digital platforms that are implicated in economies of abstraction and exploitation that led to the African diaspora. Creative practices in Afro-Surrealism offers an alternative architecture curriculum that is embodied, self-referential, and collective. Architecture students in the global north, where our teaching has taken place, who are global south students, that is BIPOC students, are often global south captives in the global north. And our curriculum repositions Blackness as central to surrealism. And Afro-Surrealism is a neologism that was created by Amira Baraka, a poet in the late 20th century, to refer retrospectively to the Black poets and artists who found liberation in surrealist methodology and a collective Black experience that continues to work in a surrealist methodology. As you can see in the earlier works of Ramir Bearden and Carol Walker, to cite only two examples. Jean-Michel Basquiat. A surrealist methodology breaks down the distinction between dream and waking life to create a realism that is more real than real, and surreal, and available to everyone. Creative practices in Afro-Surrealism spans across time and space for transformation in real lived experience through new forms of aesthetic practices and material studies. The result is a reordering of the events and objects of the everyday landscape and language for an alternative to the present. The theory praxis curriculum presented in our chapter operates as a community that gathers collective and individual impressions for shared and individual projects. It's customizable to accommodate a large variety of approaches. The curriculum is expressed in multiple media, such as photo montage, superimposition.
Jeffrey, can we just check if we're on the same slide as you?
Well, we're not actually within the presentation. Let me come out. Let's stop sharing. These slides will really begin after
our introduction.
Right. So,
Collage and autonomous writing. Knowledge of the African indigenous diaspora that comes through embodied, self-referential, and collective experience is central to the formation of a new decolonized architecture practice in the global North and South.
as we were saying, the slide, we will present some more slides after we introduce the project itself. So Creative Practices in Afro-Surrealism is a co-authored pedagogy paper that introduces a histography project that results in case studies of a new curriculum in architecture schools in the global North and South. The paper situates the curriculum within the Afro-Surrealism exhibition of the historical avant-garde and highlights its significance in the decolonization of architecture curriculum. The case studies presented in the paper presents new forms of individual and collective embodied knowledge in multiple media. The paper presents a curriculum that has developed at Pratt Institute and Yale University in the US. We have elected to show our current projects in Afro-Surrealism to demonstrate the way that the theory continues to work in our lives and practices.
For students whose knowledge of the African indigenous diaspora is often rudimentary, the curriculum introduces new forms of embodied and collective knowledge that results in a felt experience that takes place through practices that can be expressed in alternative media. The narratives of landscape and decolonization are learned as an embodied, self-referential, and a collective experience. The operation of the rhizome that expands across time and space introduces students to new experiences of landscape and place in a trans-historical present. Afro-Surrealism provides a space for real lived experience for students who have often become apolitical, ahistorical, and therefore afuturistic as captives in the global north.
If architecture is to respond to the knowledge of the African and indigenous diaspora, it will embrace embodied, self-referential, and collective knowledge in Afro-Surrealism. Jeffrey and I began to work together on the anthology In Search of African American Space, Redressing Racism. Our work together on the anthology led us to teach together in the projects that are described in the anthology. I invited Jeffrey to present a lecture on Afro-Surrealism to students at Yale University who are learning to design projects in the Gullah Geechee community in coastal South Carolina, a maroon community of formerly enslaved with close ties to Africa. We worked together to develop the Pratt Weeksville Archive, an oral history and critical ethnography project in Weeksville, a self-supporting African-American community in Brooklyn, founded in 1837 on the lines of the Lenape settlement. The Weeksville community is today a heritage center that is centered in a landscape of the past, present, and future in central Brooklyn. It is a campus of historic buildings and interpretive garden that references the Lenape indigenous past surrounded by generations of housing projects that have effectively decimated the Black community for generations. And now we will present a series of slides. So creative practice. This is the publication In Search of African American Space, and which was published in 2020 by Lars Mueller Press. And this work is something that really spurred much of the combined work in partnership between Jeffrey and myself. Jeffrey, would you like to talk about this course?
Yes, you know, the premise of the anthology is if the African American experience emerges from slavery, what can architecture say to the African American experience, especially an architecture whose primary purpose is to fortify the state? And in putting together the anthology, we found various approaches to the topic by different authors. Central to our project was the Weeksville Heritage Set, which we'll now talk about a little more.
And also from that anthology, as we said in the paper in our introduction, we developed a course connecting to the archive of Weeksville. Weeksville is a community that was developed in the 1830s in Brooklyn, New York. And we seek to place ourselves in this location because of its entrenched historical nature, and also of its contemporary kind of absence in the community.
Yes.
Also, go ahead.
Weeksville it remains a mystery for us. It flourished as a self-supporting African-American community for about 30 years, one generation, and produced an incredible array of institutions, amazing degree of prosperity, self-supporting community. And then by the 1880s, 1890s, during the period of beginning of Jim Crow segregation in the US, it largely disappeared from the map. A few houses remained and a few families remained from the original settlement. In the 1960s, there was an effort, as you can see in this slide, to begin to restore the community. It was a ground up effort by local children, Boy Scouts, different people in the community. And here you can see a map of Weeksville with the New York City Housing Authority projects on one side and the public health office of the city of New York on the other side, and then a row of housing projects on the third side. Our research has led us to locate people in the community who were logical descendants of the original Weeksville inhabitants, and to develop a timeline and interview them through oral history project to recreate the relationship between the past, present, and future in central Brooklyn for a design methodology, which we then apply to the studio that we teach together, that we're teaching now this semester.
Yes, and in this ethnographic process, as you see, 3 of the people at which we interviewed all belong to this one church that was foundational to the kind of development of Weeksville. And we also had another member who was in her 90s that we also interviewed, who imparted a great deal of connective information about the history of the location of Weeksville itself, and also some of the kind of cultural practices that have come and gone throughout the community. These interviews were recorded, and so both video and also audio interviews that then become part of the archive in which our students reference and continue to work with. As another part of the, oh, go ahead, Jeffrey.
It's our theory that self-supporting 19th century Black communities can provide a model for 20th century communities.
Right, and also as part of this process, we're having students engage in the kind of developing the skill of collage making and thinking through collage. And so we have them looking at collage artists. In particular, we're looking at African diasporic artists and how they have started to represent 2 of those artists that we begin with are Romare Burden, one piece that we show here, another here. How is it that these artists begin to represent community and people? How is it that they represent time? What are some of the topics in which they are trying to address spatially within their work? Another artist is Kara Walker, and start to discuss again what are some of kind of cultural and historic references in which these artists are connecting back into, let's say, the Harlem Renaissance, that they are starting to make reference in their own contemporary work. How is it that they make sense of the kind of colonial past and or the past of enslavement, and reconcile, if not reconcile themselves with that knowledge and that information? How is it still dealt with, be that positive, negative, and or any other way? Again, Kara Walker's work. And this is work here of some of our students as they started to develop their collage work to study their particular central Brooklyn area. We have some images here which look at the Brownsville area. The students begin to look at how it existed historically through collage, and that this process of superimposition and layering also starts to become questions of how do they start to develop an architecture within these historic areas. dealing with, again, tough subject matters such as hypervigilance, over-policing, violence within the community, all of those types of things, high incarceration rates that happen within many of these communities, and what is that impact spatially and environmentally. Joy and also how is it that people collectively come together? Again, looking at some of these collages that the students are developing to make sense of the reading that they're doing in unison with the coursework. And here we start to also look at what are some of the generative kind of practices within a community. As you see here, community gardens are community development. And to begin to talk about how do you deal with the kind of disenfranchisement of these communities? How do you deal with the kind of abandonment of locations and spaces so that they don't become prey to predatory developers? How is it that the community begins to develop these sites? And again, students starting to use these formats. How is it that the students also connect this information that they're seeing happening in a contemporary time in the community? And how does it connect to the past, both the far past and the near past? So that these practices are not necessarily new practices, but they are a continuation of things that have gone on since the inception of the community within the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in this way, our curriculum is able to weave through history of the Black Panthers programs, Angela Davis's carceral logic, and prison abolition work, and also Catherine McKittrick's slave gardens of the dispossessed in the essay Plantation Futures. As they're learning how to study their sites and study Central Brooklyn and create collages so that the felt experience of history becomes central to our teaching.
And in this final project that we're showing here, the students found a kind of an extinct structure, Ebbets Field, which is an extremely important location that has been destroyed. It was the home to the Brooklyn Dodgers, which was also the first African-American to enter into the National Baseball League. Jackie Robinson played at this field. It was also a site for integration, that was very important to the integration of the United States. And so the students sought to reintroduce some aspect of this site. As you see in this particular collage, that there's an accompanying paper that comes along with this, a series of mappings, and also the project that starts to manifest here in the center, and a couple of images. They developed a timeline that starts to position the transition of the site itself from a kind of integrative baseball field that brought the community together at large and the nation actually together, and its contemporary state as a large housing development. And the project asks the question as to, which works or which was more important here, this gathering location as a kind of important historical site, and or this housing development, which has contentious kinds of relations with the community at this current time. And the students develop.
Our students come to us in the 8th semester of a 10-semester architecture course, and they're unaccustomed to developing collages as a design generator. So it generally takes us 3 or 4 weeks of work to develop collages like you've just seen, which is part of the learning process of having to undo the logics of representation that they've been taught as architects. They're also unaccustomed to showing groups of people in their renderings or people of color in their renderings. And that was a process for us also.
So with that, and this is the kind of dissecting of the collage work, and just trying to show at least what is at the core of reconstituting this one project, of reintroducing evidence field as a collective space for empowerment and for joy. Thank you very much. And share that.
Thank you, Jeffrey and Scott. We didn't realize Scott would be joining us, so my apologies for not introducing him earlier on. But thank you for your presentation. I think Adam, you're next. Yeah, in person, yay.
So my chapter in the book is called Feeling Bodies of Architecture, and it really considers a simple question, which I'll get to in a second. Well, here it is. The question is, why is it easier to talk about the end of the world or of crisis than it is to talk about bodies and their feelings? I mean this not as a kind of hypothetical question, but as a real one that could have real impact and import in not only architectural pedagogy, but the broader spatial pedagogies, and in fact, pedagogy in general. In architectural crits, at least in the situations I'm aware of, which mostly center in the UK context, some relation with architecture schools in Canada and the US. I'm less familiar with others. There are many design units that focus on climate justice and the climate emergency, on housing and dispossession, on gentrification, on the racial Capitalocene, and histories of slavery. But very rarely do they center the question of desire, of feeling, of affect, or in those crits and in those design units, allow for the very bodies that are doing the body work of architecture to surface their embodiment, their own histories, their own feelings, their own sensate affects. So I just wanted to introduce that notion by reading one short paragraph from the book, which many of you might have not have had a chance to look at yet. Actually, I've already just said it in my riffing. So yeah, why is it easier to talk about the end of the world than it is to talk about bodies and their feelings? But I ask, it's really rare, it's difficult, it's uncomfortable even to talk radically of desire, to talk not of the body in abstract, to talk not just of embodiment as a cultural theory, but to talk of bodies, their tenderness, their trauma, of skin and leakages, of pleasure and objection, of aged bodies, historic bodies, of raced bodies, of classed and gendered bodies, of maimed bodies or crip bodies, of lesbian, trans, gay, intersex, bisexual, asexual, and two-spirited bodies, of bodies that labor, of sex-working bodies, of spent bodies, of dead bodies, of loose or tight bodies, of emotional bodies, of feeling bodies, of sensate bodies. And of course, when we talk about pedagogy, I need to kind of give a background of some of the people I've learned from. Here, two colleagues, Hannah Jones and Emma Jackson, who invited me into their project, Stories of Cosmopolitan Belonging, Emotion and Location. And I was able to rethink some of my work from my PhD back in 2013 on the architecture and urbanism of Mexico City, and to think about revolution not as a political project or an economic one necessarily, but an affective one, an emotional one, and one that transformed the affective relation with the city through architecture. A second project is an invitation from one of my mentors, Dr. Yoksum Wong, who I met in my undergrad in Canada and who has been a big part of my life in academia all the way throughout, was a series of workshops that she and Karen Engel began back in 2013 and carried on until 2018, called Alternatively Structures of Feeling or Feelings of Structure. And in those workshops, we were invited to present work in process, artifacts, ideas, not through any curated relation, but through a method of instinct and affect. We'd gather in a room, one person would start, and whoever felt like they should go next, whoever had a feeling that theirs connected, not in terms of content or any other kind of instructional way, but in a felt sense. I need to go next. I feel like I need to connect with what was said. And that's how we would build conversation. So a kind of curation of emergence, but one through the bodies in the room and through their relation to felt sense. This led to a chapter in that book that I wrote about frames, about the architectural frame, the window, in relation to love, and it was called Love's Perspective. Thirdly, I've learned, I don't have a slide here, from my artistic hat in performance and voice work, but I've learned mostly from colleagues in dance, whose own vocabulary around the felt sense in the body is incredibly rich, and one that I think our pedagogies can learn from. The invitation from Harriet, Ashraf, and Anna came to me around the time, like many of us, in COVID times. And it just so happened that the professor and dean, Adrian Lahoud, where I was working in the School of Architecture, had instigated a set of informal meetings, initially for staff and students of color in the School of Architecture to gather, and later for others to join as listeners and witnesses. In his words, it arrived at a tripartite moment of a pandemic, of a resurfacing of a long-standing global movement around Black Lives Matter, centered in the US condition, albeit, and one of a failure of institutions to respond. So he opened these Zooms at the time. They weren't rooms with bodies, but Zooms with bodies. And at a certain moment, those who did not identify as a student or faculty of color were able to join. They were really instructive because in the room, and at this time, like I said, it's interesting, the room wasn't full of bodies, but of digital bodies. There was distance in the room. It was in this that it was the first time in the School of Architecture that I really witnessed the surfacing of feelings of vulnerability, of care, of attention to holding a space, of boundaries and borders, and of conditions of witness. And I wondered why it happened in this condition, which is a form of pedagogy, but an informal one, and not in those formal design units, in those moments of the crit or the submission, the other violences of language that Professor Harriet Harriss offered us this morning. In the chapter, I was thinking about this moment. I was thinking about my own pedagogy, which centered on feelings, design units I'd ran in the Masters of Research on the architecture of aspiration, the architecture of care, and the last one was the architecture of loss. But rather than focus on the work I'd done in my pedagogy, I wanted to use the chapter to try and think through this call or this sense that myself and many others had to surface feelings in architectural pedagogy. As a queer faculty and a non-binary faculty in the School of Architecture, I also wanted to employ and think critically through and with queer colleagues and queer theory, of which in the architectural canon, there's not a lot when you go looking for it. But I also wanted to take the call from the editors to engage with decolonial theory and decolonial curriculums. And queer theory and decolonial theory actually have a tense history together because of the Anglo-American centering of a lot of the genesis of queer theory in the 80s and 90s. So I looked to two critical friends. I looked to Boaventura de Sousa Santos and specifically his book, The End of Cognitive Empire. And I looked to the work of Jose Esteban Munoz and his posthumous book, which was collated by editor colleagues of his, The Sense of Brown, that came out in 2020. I was interested in both of them because they use architectural and spatial metaphors in their understanding of the cognitive, and they also make reference to feeling and felt sense as central to their projects. Here a quote from Boaventura de Sousa Santos: "Knowledge is not possible without experience, and experience is inconceivable without the sense and the feelings they arouse in us." And from Munoz: "In lieu of viewing racial or ethnic difference as solely cultural, I aim to describe how race and ethnicity can be understood as affective difference, by which I mean the ways in which various historically coherent groups feel differently and navigate the material world on a different emotional register." I won't go into detail. You can read the book, or if you can't access the book, email me and I'll send you a PDF of the chapter. But I work through these two thinkers and many other kind of critical colleagues to think through a paradox. And a paradox that comes as this: so often feelings, so often the autoethnographic, so often our sensate are either diminished because the feeling is not rational or the feeling is not welcome, or there's not enough experience in the room to handle or to manage or to hold space for feelings to surface. Or we're told that they're too singular, that singular feelings and sensate are anecdotal, they're important, but they're too singular to deal with structural issues of the climate crisis, of economic disparity, of racial and gendered violence, of epistemic genocide. How can feelings, how can an individual sensate approach those questions? And we get answers from both. We get answers from both de Sousa Santos and from Munoz, which give us a lot of hope. They bring us both to a kind of a beautiful phrase that Munoz gives us, which is, rather than looking for a politics of equivalence that might then be scalar or might then be structural, equivalence across, identity politics or across class-based politics or even trade unionism, as I said, which are useful in organizing against structural violence, but to also see feeling and felt sense as a possibility of being in common indifference and not always looking for the undoing of difference in order to be in common. And I think that there's something around the capacity, the language, vocabulary of felt sense and of feeling inside design pedagogy that can bring us some way to this. I'll just take 1 minute to show where this is led. It's not in the chapter, but around the same time as writing the chapter, myself and colleagues, Dr. Tandy Lowenson and Dr. David Burns, we started a research collective called Fiction Feeling Frame, which is as ambiguous as those three terms together. But it's meant to enable a whole bunch of different work around feelings, around fiction, and around frames of media and history to come together. We were able to curate an event in Hashim Sarkis's biennial in 2021, which was a global conversation, a durational performance for 24 hours. We started in Venice with 2 people speaking for half an hour. After half an hour, one of them dropped off and someone from the next time zone joined in for half an hour. And that continued around the world for 24 hours until the next day we came back to Venice. And there was a simple question that each of them was meant to answer: how do we speak together? This is carried on, and actually just last week we've had a workshop on critical spatial dialogue, really trying to think, if feelings and sense are meant to be part of the pedagogy, then perhaps we need to be really thoughtful and knowledgeable and experimental in how we set up the spaces for dialogue and its capacity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great, thank you, Adam. I think last up we have Alejandro Haiek, Coll, and he's online.
Thank you very much for this invitation, Professor Harriet Harriss and And of course, to my colleague, Senia Jubei, which was a pleasure to put these things together, this chapter together. Since a little more than 2 decades ago, we established a critical review of learning environments, pedagogical methods, and instrumental tools, anticipated to the society, the issues that now we are facing today in a global society. We were looking forward to opening alternative for collaborating learning platforms, open classrooms, and remote and decentralized online multimedia resources. We question with this research which competences students must learn today in a world in permanent crisis and unstoppable evolution. But especially what tools are necessary to tackle the scale and the complexity of those planetary problems. And especially if it would be possible to open to or to create an open source global apply knowledge or source of knowledge which blur the boundaries of institutions and open more possibilities for everybody. So we argue, of course, that education should happen outside the box and beyond the box. The new forms of educational institutions also have been popping up and arising in this new era. The students are no longer tied to a physical locations, but neither to their curriculums. And the digital transformation of education have finally set students free from the confines of the physical institutions. We think that this is an opportunity to use pedagogies to vanquish digital and physical inequalities. But of course, we still, and especially in spatial practice, we still starting from simulate our practice or reproduce in a controlled environment what we need to do in a professional practice. And it's time to move beyond or from simulating to experiencing and to try to set up different academical environments or learning environments with allowed to control or set up some sort of rules in a real-time space. And experience-based learning from students seems to be the ability to invent these new hybrid roles that our society is demanding today. The education without walls open completely a new experience for students to navigate in complex regulatory and in non-institutional contexts, blurring the limits between and the boundaries between disciplines, and especially intersecting them in a kind of a more complex palimpsest, expanding especially the logic of infrastructure to the streets, to where things happen. And this is Latin America, South America, and especially to alter those formative pedagogies, new complexities need to rise in the civic and political life, which actually begin to resonate with global priorities. Those territories have been disrupted with the violence plans growing by the idea of progress and transforming the geography on the ground in a complex artificial constructions, which in some point left half of the populations outside of the logic of institutions and infrastructure. Those conditions where knowledge happens or where learning process take place is something that became interesting to us to understand the new physicality where new forms of knowledge and subjectivity could happen, rethinking or resemanticizing the logic of the city that we know today, from squares, plazas, corners, streets, to other kind of physicality that open possibility to new interactions, new confrontations, and new frictions in a completely new public space. as we see this carefully, this half of the populations that they don't necessarily go to the formal grid, into the formal institutions, but actually grow within the infrastructure, opening up new ground from learning exchange. We try to see beyond that complexity and that logics of informalities and see what is the script, the code that is inside of these territories, and understanding how they share knowledge, resources, tools, and experiences. And basically, we realized that one of the first argument or the first strategy is to create an active citizenship, to understand that educations start in an idea to be a citizenship. And for architects, it's quite common to talk about communities, but we never belong to ones. And it seems that from the perspective of a citizenship is the first ways to get in contact with others. Those spaces happen, or the nature of citizenship happen alongside the different generations. And then the different forms of educations happen not just in the schools, but actually in the space of frictions. Some of the tracking or the traces that we have been finding is a way to also understand that the traditions and local knowledge or popular knowledge is embedded in all these territories, as same as scientific knowledge and academic knowledge. But all of them are facing the same. From the perspective of the citizenship, they need to deal with massive infrastructures that control in a balanced way the ground. They need to deal, of course, with the decadency, the obsolescence of those technological apparatus, as same as deal with economy and climate in a different perspective. The second approach to that is to imagine that those territories are also free zones for technological democratizations, where knowledge pass through generations to generations, maybe in the use of tools, in the use of technologies that help us to objectivize the reality and make it intelligible and transmissible for others. So making these strong cartographies, we are able to track the sources of knowledge into special traditions and cultural heritage, to them understand how they are dealing and intersecting with new knowledge and new capacities. Those learning patterns help us also to recognize or produce these cognitive diagrams and infographic structures where we manipulate or intentionally found a way to discover knowledge that is embedded in those complex territories and try to reproduce it in a common ground, in a common space where all this knowledge from the past and from the future are same as the informal knowledge and the formal knowledge, or the popular knowledge and academic knowledge encounter in a place where the differences is what actually build this notion of togetherness. But even though we try to find knowledge expertises inside these informal territories and try to cartograph in order and create different forms of knowledge democratizations and also knowledge experiences, to then work through generations and generations, trying to use or actually time as an important variable in knowledge production. What happened after a revision of 20 years, we can see we can track a giant amount of let's say social innovations or ingenuity that happen within the necessities and the needs and the inventions of new tools to discover and interpret the reality that's around them. So then all of them transform actually in components or elements that are reproduced by other persons, and they are an open source information, shareable and able to be democratized with others. We try to do that, especially in recover all these informations in catalogs that then we redistribute in order to always have some sort of a instruments that help us to emancipate those forms of knowledge. Especially in tracking these knowledge structures, always we are able to understand the time again, but the time where this knowledge happens in the territory that suffer continuous obsolescence as happening in Latin America, and where the decadence and the destructions of the ground, of the public ground, is actually contribute to the disappearance of this knowledge. But then it's interesting always to bring it back and to see how we create really immersive environments that help us to discover, for instance, in this case, in this picture, how the masterman Rufo was able to show to the kids in these communities the special notes that he used to do to transport melon. But then architecture have the way to introduce that knowledge inside again into this operative ground where knowledge is passing through a generation to generation. But especially what we need to focus is that those systems is actually going against or in parallel of the formal systems, which we know that all the establishing disciplines are able to respond to the market. But that knowledge that is not deriving from the forces of the market and the forces of the capital, then transform in a symbolic capital where there is an alternative markets that happen to reproduce that knowledge and create another ways to symbolize and to identify in these new forms of productions. And what is interesting is that they didn't clash with the formal arts in this sense. Let's say that those spaces are able to intersect the formal arts with urban arts or ephemeral arts or spontaneous arts, forms of arts that happen within these informal sites. Then the situations go worse, and when in Venezuela the crisis reached the maximum point where even difficult to have a democratic process of informations, they were channels were taken by the states, same as the universities were trying to infiltrate by the state apparatus, and then the free forms of education were completely disappeared by an ideological purpose. So then our kids were in the streets, fighting that ideological collisions, and that brings us back again to the planetary perspective of knowledge and understanding as entangled society. So where the problems that we actually share experience is actually shared with other countries in other part of the world. We initiate this after being 20 years, getting very deep and getting deep into all these communities. Most of us were forced to go out and then try to run practices, academical practice from outside of Venezuela, in this case, to invite other participants to join to these important issues. And the first international workshops that we made from UMIA University, supported by UMIA University, were in contact with 2 universities in Colombia, 2 more in Venezuela, and we were facing the situations of migration, the migration crisis. We were able to create immersive learning environments, decentralized, remote, and collective learning interface that were supportive tools and methodological instruments. We were able to track and using different sources of technologies and open source data, able to track what happened really with these situations that have been blurring by the national governments. And together with students from around the world, from more than 13 countries, plus all these 4 universities of Latin America, we were able to create a map, update map, cartograph specifically what really happened, even more precise and accurate than any other institutions or departments in the state departments, and neither any other university, but in our online workshops. And that we're able to also to operate in this hyperlink metadata transscalar operations, no? Or forms of operation. Our second workshop was even more interesting. We know that everything that we're hiding by this political ideology were important to highlight and put it out in the eyes of the world. So then we join again for a second time, different universities for more than 20 participants again, and we'll try to see what really happened with the situation of the Amazons, were also having blurring and invisibilized by the strong political forces. We navigate, journey up the Orinoco River, the same as Humboldt did 200 years ago. And we were able to track, again, with open sources, informations, the fluxes, economical fluxes, and, that actually control that forms of exploitations in Latin America. We were able to create, actually, these multi-scalar apparatus or device or tools where intersect different softwares and make us understand from different sources what really happened, discovering the strong forms of industrializations that the Amazonas have today in an invisible way, actually tracking the growing of one of the oldest mines from the 70s, growing 1 kilometer per year, same as tracking the situation of the Uberito forest, the biggest man-made forest planted from Caribbean pine, and now creating a kind of environmental disaster due to the crisis of management. Same as the mercury contaminations from the gold industries into the indigenous communities, and same as the cosmology of Pemon communities with these digital tools. Working together with people on ground, we were able to create different forms of innovations from social practice in an academy first. Also, create key pedagogies to testing the roles of our disciplines can play in the society, in this important societal change. Also, introducing to students an ethical practice or ethical approach to practice their disciplines by giving students this methodological basis and equipments. Also with complex tools, they were able to navigate to this ethical context, and we can claim a right to architecture in these border conditions. We strive now for establishing architectural pedagogies that address the climate crisis and resonate with the global priorities. Education methodologies which generate real infrastructure, new cultural rituals, and labor economies that unite communities and a straight society, but especially an approach of resilience that can be instrumental for pedagogies to address the climate crisis and socioeconomic instability, which we will face globally. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Alejandro. I'm just gonna open up the floor to any questions here in the room. Okay, if not, we have. I do have a question. Do you have a question? Yeah.
I haven't read your essay, Adam, but it was very interesting, and I now definitely will. So thank you for talking around your contribution. And you mapped out the networks through which you're sort of engaging in your discourse of care, and I wanted to know if you could just share a little bit, or expand a little bit about what you feel the outcome of that is, and how impactful the outcome is. I mean, I think it's a fabulous idea. But I'm just keen about what direction it's now taking you, having established it, or where you would like it to go, or where you think it might go. We could sort of riff on that for a while.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks, Mark. I think I'll answer it in two ways. The first will be an answer, and the second will be a question to another panelist, actually. I think what I found interesting is in the architectural research studios I've run, on care, on loss, on aspiration, is that the method employed did not involve surfacing feelings. It was concerned with affect in the environment, or emotional geographies, or affect in architecture, in a relatively kind of, conditional way of one producing an affect in the other, and that we can design or not affects in the environment. But because we were dealing with questions of care, of languages of feeling, especially the project on loss began the autumn before COVID and carried on through the year, it did kind of surface a different approach than maybe some other architectural pedagogies. The work we're doing now in Fiction, Feeling, Frame is really centered on the question of we don't know where it's going. But what we do know is that so far, in the context we've created for experimental dialogue, people emerge from it enlivened, excited, wanting more. How that translates in design, I don't know. But there's something about it that is enlivening, and it takes time. It doesn't necessarily see an outcome. But my second answer is a question to Jeffrey and Scott, because actually in your chapter, I was so excited to read that you already employ a pedagogy that allows for personal experience, for feelings and senses to come into your teaching. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how that works and what some of the challenges are in that practice.
Jeffrey, your mic
I
is
have to
on.
unmute myself. Yes, I'm muted. Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think that, first of all, I've always felt that Jose Munoz's work is essentially architectural. So I really appreciate your reading of Munoz. And I'm also a professor of performance and performance study at Pratt. We have a developing program in that area. And a lot of our work has been engaged in bringing in performance into the studio in a different way than the students are accustomed to. I think that the challenges, of course, is that architecture school, and 8th semester architecture students, the feelings have been pretty crushed out for the students by the 8th semester. First semester students, you can work with easily, but the 8th semesters. So it was a challenge. And one of the things that really helped us in developing our pedagogy was to introduce the work of Black feminist writers who engage in a really advanced level of subjective discourse, such as Christina Sharp and Angela Davis. And by introducing these texts to the students, we invited them to explore their own backgrounds and lived experience, through the work of writers who had worked for years to develop a mature discourse in this area. And we find that Christina Sharp, particularly, her work in the Wake really helps to open up the students. Additionally, we showed them a work by performance artists such as Mary Elizabeth Baxter and things like that. So that's how we've been able to invite the students to share their own felt experience and lived experience.
And if I do quickly add to that, the trying to translate feeling into spatial artifact, spatial creations. You know, we begin to engage phenomenological types of practices, but within that, I really love the quote where you had where the person said the difference of experiences, right? One can design an expected experience, but you cannot anticipate how everyone is going to engage that experience you try to create. And you know, and that is something that we still struggle with, but you have to say, okay, you presented something, you had an objective to evoke a certain emotion, you're experiencing a certain, you're responding to certain stimuli. So the reading, be it a conversation with a person that lives in the community, the students have, you know, very visceral responses to their experiences of you know, walking practices as well, right? To be in the space, a site visit is not just one visit. A site visit is you go there at night, you speak with the people, you smell the air, you taste the air, and trying to have that type of visceral experience that then informs how you make and what you make. So that's where we are.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions in this room? No, I just wanna, I actually have a question for Adam. I just wanna make sure I quote you correctly. So you were asking, why do we ignore how bodies feel? Particularly their desires. And I wanted to know, do you think that all bodies are ignored equally? All bodies ignored equally? Okay, that was quicker. That's quicker than what I expected.
No, I'm like, I'm nodding, I'm like, that's a really good question. I think the answer has to be no.
Oh, okay, I thought you were agreeing.
Yeah,
Okay.
no.
Okay, no.
I think the answer has to be no. Absolutely. And I think, that's one part of it. I also think that part of what brought me into this work was thinking about how emotional geographies are also unequally distributed. Mm-hmm. So not only in the studio or other places might some people's desires or other feelings surface more easily or more fluently without kind of the anticipation of violence or backlash or misunderstanding or mistranslation, but also that there's not an equivalence of how feelings are distributed globally or even within a city. I was thinking about a city like London, where we say that cities are changing all the time, but of course they only change in certain spaces. Only certain parts of London change routinely. And the kinds of bodies that are in those spaces who have to deal with the grief of urban loss over and over are particular bodies, are queer bodies, are bodies of color, are classed bodies. And so it's a two answer. It's A, no, and then B, also that distribution of affect is really unequal also. It's a really good question.
Great, yeah, thank you. And I also have another question for you as well. It's sort of like a follow-up. Where am I? Can't find it now. You said we have a felt sense as individuals, and is that inherent? And do you think I think maybe I'm answering my own question, but do you think our inherited social structures can have a major impact on our felt senses? Because I think felt senses are sort of like a knee-jerk reaction. And I think being I know in America they have an opioid crisis, is that when you're addicted to painkillers. But apparently it's impacted the Black community less. And I thought, wow, that's great. And then people started to delve in deeper, and it was actually because generally we view Black bodies as being able to tolerate pain. So we underprescribe painkillers for the amount of pain that maybe their white counterparts may be in, because we've inherited this perception of, well, they've been through years of violence, they can surely tolerate pain. And so I'd wondered if you don't think that maybe there's a danger in a felt sense. And I mean, is there a way to make that less like arbitrary or whimsical, and be more logical about a body's feelings, a body's pain, not just a felt sense. That's really difficult, I think, but I just wondered.
No, I think that's a really, really important question. I don't know if I know enough to answer, but everything you say sounds right. And I think the little I know from colleagues in kind of somatic-based therapy, so not kind of talk-based therapy, but like body-based therapy, and thinking around intergenerational trauma and around social relations of the way in which felt sense aren't kind of innate or ahistorical or asocial, but constructed vis-a-vis that. Both are interpretations of them and our very feelings. So I think that's a really, like, it's making me think a lot, a really powerful question. And I think in a short presentation like that, even the language, like the grammar of we, I think is unhelpful. And so it makes me think there's all the more reason why spaces that can surface this kind of language and bring in complexity to that language, rather than a kind of flattening of equivalence, or not equivalence of feeling, but as you raise, even an equivalent of what an affect might be or what a felt sense might be. I think it's, totally fundamental. And I mean, I wonder if Jeffrey or Scott might have from their I don't know if we have time.
I mean, I'm going to ask if I could get like a nod or a shake of the head if we can continue with questions. Yes, we could. I mean, if you guys would like to input, would be great. Yes.
It's interesting because I was looking at Alejandro's presentation and our and our work, which tends to be on more on the collective space scale, as opposed to the personal body scale, and it goes back and forth because you have to have that dialogue. But as soon as you go into the collective scale, to begin to discuss this notion of spaces that are made for people, for these kind of disenfranchised people, these for people who are not seen, and for people who are pushed to the margins, and to say, okay, we are designing space that is meant for you to thrive, and to dwell within, begins to engage this question of, I don't know if it's engaging pain, but it is engaging let's say some level of medicinal kinds of treatment to the hardships of dwelling within a society that does not want you or include you, so to speak. And so, this question of the Black bodies tolerating pain is interesting. But again, I think it has these polar kind of aspects to it, the body, and then there's this collective space. And this is where the collective space of joy that many communities seem to squeak out and create for themselves. And then what our work tries to do is to make that work more prevalent, make that work more substantial, and not so fleeting in that sense.
It's wonderful. Thank you. Thanks. Could I read some of the comments that we got in the chat, and then maybe we could close? Okay. So there's a comment from Anna Gritching. She says, "Thank you, Scott and Jeffrey. I really enjoyed learning about your work in pedagogy, especially the use of collage." Ashraf says, "Thank you so much, Adam. Excellent presentation." David Andrew says, "Excellent presentation, Adam." Veronica King says, "Thank you for that powerful comment, Scott Ruff. Excellent presentation and really interesting." Lone Paulson says, "Excellent presentation and really interesting work." Emotional geography, clicking fingers, from Veronica King. And then brilliant question on bodies. Oh, thank you. Thank you. A powerful question on bodies. Thank you, Veronica King. And we need more Black joy. I agree with that. That's from Boitumelo. Sorry, Veronica. It's from Veronica. And then Lone Paulson has a comment. She says, "Alejandro, I particularly appreciated the intergenerational reading and co-production of space, as we often look and interpret through our own life stages." So that's from Lone. Are there any more questions? Wrap up now. All right, excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.